Picture with me those iconic images of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. What do you recall? No doubt many of us think of police, dogs, hoses, marches, boycotts, sit-ins. The unforgettable witness of those trying times are the images of consistent, intentional, nonviolent resistance. Now, what if I told you that nonviolent resistance was not the original plan? What if I told you that a man you've never heard of is responsible for the entire trajectory of that movement toward nonviolence? We have to go back in the story to Montgomery, Alabama, and the bus boycott there in the late winter of 1956. You see, this is an important time in the movement because the movement's at a crossroads. This young preacher from Atlanta, Dr. King, and his family are receiving for the first time serious threats against their life. And because of those threats, they've taken to finding protection from armed guards. Now, a seemingly inconsequential lieutenant in the movement, a man named Bayard Rustin, sees an opportunity for something different. He actually confronts Dr. King on the point of guns. And he says this movement must go forward with a commitment to consistent, intentional nonviolence. Now, Dr. King received that challenge and accepted it, and the rest, as I say, is history. But I want you to imagine with me how history would have turned out if not for Bayard Rustin. What if there was no discernible difference between the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and that of Malcolm X? What if the path that Dr. King took was that of by any means necessary? The courage to look beyond one's circumstances and ask, what is God doing now? How might He be at work in our midst? That's what's on display in the life of Bayard Rustin. That's what we see in the heroic life of Dr. King. I want my life to be set on those priorities, and I believe that you do too. And that's why our text, I think, offers us profound help today. The book of Acts records over and over again, instance after instance, in which God's people ignore the dire circumstances of their situation in order to ask consistently this question: what is God doing here and now? Where is the gospel leading us now? And that's what we've come to examine in the life of Paul today. You see, Paul is an exemplary model for us of the sojourner, of the disciple who decides to follow Jesus no matter the cost. He does that because principally he places the gospel ahead of even of his own self-preservation, his own life even. So as we look at the witness of Paul here in Acts 24 to 26, at a moment in which his life hangs in the balance of a provincial Roman courtroom, there's, I think, at least three things that we can learn. Paul's model shows us that, number one, we should know Caesar's laws. Number two, we should as much as possible satisfy the demands of Caesar's law. But thirdly, and most importantly, we must surrender ourselves to the priority of the gospel, even if it costs us our lives. That's what I want to look at with you today. Let me briefly summarize this moment in the life of Paul's his incarceration story. And let me borrow some better words than I'm using at the moment. I like what John Stott said in describing this moment in Paul's life. He said, it's like a butterfly before a steamroller. That's what Paul is in comparison to the religious authority of Jerusalem and the military power of Rome. A butterfly before a steamroller. Paul has escaped the religious authorities in Jerusalem, and he's managed to reveal to his overlords that he is in fact a Roman citizen, and as a citizen, he's afforded certain rights and privileges. And so begins the 2+ years in which his Jewish opponents lobby these regional overlords for Paul's release so that they can murder him. Ultimately, Paul feels compelled to appeal all the way up to Caesar, as we just heard. Now this most likely saves his life, but most importantly, allows the gospel to go to the imperial capital. So in keeping with the ironic pattern of the book of Acts, Paul's misfortune becomes a victory for the gospel message. The more important question is this: does Paul follow his own instructions, namely the imperatives of Romans 13? Let me remind you, verse 1, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. Verse 7, give to everyone what you owe them: taxes, revenue, respect, honor. Does he fulfill even his own instructions? He does. Astonishingly, he does for the sake of the gospel. And that's what I want to explore more closely. First, Paul teaches us to study Caesar's law. To study Caesar's law. Here, Luke shows us, once again, the amazing providential ways in which God has equipped and prepared Paul for this ministry to the Gentiles. Paul is not only well acquainted with the laws of the land, but also its customs and traditions. We need only compare Paul's oration here in Acts 26 before Festus and Agrippa with what he says before the Sanhedrin in Acts 22. Let me give you some examples. 26 verse 1 tells us that Paul gestured with his hand to begin his defense. I want you to try this with me. Raise your right hand and join your thumb and your middle finger. Okay? You see three fingers left, all right? These are the 3 points that Paul will make in his defense. Very good. You guys are excellent participants. I am wielding so much power here. This is the traditional way in which orators would signal the beginning of the exordium, the 3-part speech that Paul's going to make. But more importantly than that, verse 10 of chapter 24 and the beginning of chapter 26 demonstrates that Paul knows that before he makes his defense, he must offer special praise to the judge who would hear his case. Chapter 24, verse 19, Paul knows that he can't be properly tried if his accusers are absent. Chapter 25, verse 10, Paul knows that his opponents should not be granted a change of venue. He doesn't have to go to Jerusalem. But most importantly, however, Paul knows and understands his options afforded to him in Roman law as a citizen. When he feels desperate for his life, chapter 25, verse 11, he makes his ultimate appeal to Caesar. And while this might be no lifeline in the end, it does offer him an escape in the moment. So let me emphasize the urgency of Paul's example here. Let me be clear. Ignorance of the law and the consequences of such ignorance do not, I'm afraid, constitute persecution. I want to say that again. Ignorance of the law does not constitute persecution. Christians in the West are often quick to cry persecution when in fact we have not done our homework. We're not well acquainted with the law of the land into which God has sent us. When Jesus says, I am with you always, we should not infer that we can avoid or neglect or dismiss the laws of the land in which we dwell. After all, he implores us to be wise as serpents. And Paul is not ashamed to do just that, and we should not be either. It means great gain for the gospel. Knowledge of the law, however, doesn't mean much if you can't present yourself as living in conformity with it. So secondly, Paul shows us that we should satisfy Caesar's law as much as possible. In other words, as much as possible, we should abide by the law of the land. When Jesus called Paul, his call anticipated that Paul would have to give a defense before kings and princes. Acts 23:11 says, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. Now, Paul's appeal to Caesar here providentially fulfills Jesus' call on his life, but it also requires responsible and wise action on the part of the apostle. It is absolutely necessary that Paul can say with a perfectly clear conscience in this Roman court of law, I have done nothing wrong. That's integral to what God is doing here. Now, I want you to think about how difficult that is. Let's press into the complexity here. Paul is embattled in a political or legal conflict, but it's over a theological issue. That is so messy. Consider the complexity of that, because as we see in history, it's a pattern that repeats itself over and over again, and we're not exempt from it. But look again at verse 8 of chapter 25. Here Paul says that he is not a threat to the Jews, the temple, or to Caesar. The way of Jesus is not set on overthrowing the government or undoing the law. So Paul can say with a clear conscience that he's not here to trouble Caesar or to take Caesar's throne. That, as you well know, however, is not the whole story. Like Paul, we have to accept the irreducibly political implications of the gospel. It is certainly much more than political, but it is certainly not less. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow, but someday and someday soon, the gospel will turn the world upside down. Amen? While Caesar sleeps in his palace, there is a quiet revolution of love underway in his midst. And though the followers of Jesus will not mount a coup, and they will not seize power through a revolt, the old social order of Rome is already unraveling in God's new covenant people. The renewal of all things is underway. Resurrection. Resurrection. Not insurrection. Resurrection is the Jesus way. Paul puts on display for us here his quiet confidence in the gospel of Christ's resurrection power. And he can handle himself with wisdom and discernment and even with love. Yes, The gospel of the resurrection will be opposed in this world. Trouble will come. But our poor conduct or our inability to abide by the law should never be the cause of it. It shouldn't. So lastly, and most importantly, Paul's example shows us that we should surrender ourselves, our own lives, to the priority of the gospel. We must put gospel witness ahead of personal defense. Let's look again at the text of Acts. Look with me at Acts 26, beginning in verse 24. At this point, Festus interrupted Paul's defense. "You are out of your mind, Paul," he shouted. "Your great learning is driving you insane." Some of us have heard that before. "I'm not insane, most excellent Festus," Paul replied. "What I am saying is true and reasonable. The king is familiar with these things, and I can speak freely to him. I'm convinced that none of this has escaped his notice, because it was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe the prophets? I know you do." Then Agrippa said to Paul, "Do you think that in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian?" Paul replied, "Short time or long, I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today become what I am, except for these chains." The king rose, and with him the governor and Bernice and those sitting with them. After they had left the room, they began saying to one another, "This man is not doing anything that deserves death or imprisonment." Agrippa said to Festus, "This man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar." For my part, I can't help but linger on those final words of the passage. Do you feel it? Do you feel the bitter irony in Agrippa's comments here? It is painful to be reminded of the arbitrary nature of such judgments, right? God's great saints have had to endure many fools and tyrants, with plenty more to come. Yes, Paul knows how to work the system, but he also knows how the system works. And he's counted the cost, and he's made his decision. And in the end, the gospel must be proclaimed, even if he perishes. So, in fact, the treatment that Paul receives at the hands of the Jews and the Romans here is not what's remarkable about this text. What's remarkable here is that in this moment, Paul has this astounding ability to ask the question, what is God doing in my midst? Where is the gospel leading me right now? And it leads him to put aside what has to have been an overwhelming preoccupation with his own survival. And in its place, he puts concern for the souls of his judges. We hear in his dialogue with Agrippa this almost wanton disregard for his own safety. Who is Paul? How dare he press Agrippa? Where does such confidence come from? Luke shows us throughout chapter 26 Paul's testimony. His testimony is his testimony in the courtroom. All he offers here is the story of God's grace poured out in his life. Now, if I'm honest, I admit that I have not experienced this level of persecution before, and I imagine that many of us in this room haven't either. Some of us, I'm sure, have. Will we soon? Who knows? Lack of experience with persecution, however, does not diminish the significance of what we can learn from Paul here. We should never let our self-defense eclipse an opportunity for the gospel. Don't try to save yourself. Don't do it. When the trial comes, don't lose sight of the moment. God is granting you to stand for his gospel. And all you have to do is stand. Just stand. That's what Paul does here. Just stand in the confidence that God has changed you and that God is still changing you and that he will change everyone who calls on his name. Just stand. Just stand in your own testimony of God's immense kindness to you in Jesus Christ. He's not looking for great heroes. He's looking for humble witnesses. That's what he wants. So just stand. Like Paul, just stand in your own story, in the story of the gospel poured out in your life. So as we conclude, let me just ask you, if you have that confidence, can you stand in your testimony? We want to offer a few moments just to reflect together. And I want to invite you to do the intentional work that Paul must have been doing in his cell in Caesarea for 2 years, reflecting on the truth about who he was. So I want to invite you to just reflect on how God has changed you. How are you different today than when he first found you? And next, I want you to reflect on how he's changing you even now. And lastly, I want you to reflect on how he's changing those in your life, how he's transforming those around you. Can you stand in that testimony? That's all he's asking. Let's spend some time quiet before the Lord.